Some women don't fight for attention. They don't chase validation. They don't demand love. And yet they linger, long after their absence. Not because of what they did, but because of what they reflected. She was the mirror he could not look away from. Not because she told him who he was, but because she showed him. In her silence, he saw himself. And that was unbearable. Every man carries two selves, the one he shows the world, and the one the world reveals to him when he meets a woman who sees. The first self is the persona, crafted, polished, protected. It's his myth of control, his projection of strength, his refuge from vulnerability. The second self is shadow, the unspoken, unseen, and often unloved part of his psyche. The rage he disowns, the need he hides, the tenderness he fears. And when he stands before a woman rooted in her stillness, in her knowing, her gaze, her emotional gravity, those hidden fragments begin to stir. She doesn't have to speak. Her energy does the unveiling. Because mirroring is not performance. It is presence. And presence has power. In Jungian psychology, the mirror is not an object. It's an archetype, a sacred symbol of reflection that strips illusion bare. The man projects. The woman reflects. And what he sees in her, it's not her. It is himself. At first, this feels intoxicating. He calls it chemistry. He calls it fate. He calls it connection. But what he's really experiencing is recognition, the unconscious sensing its own reflection. In another, he is drawn to her light, but unaware that it illuminates his shadow. He feels alive in her presence, not realizing that she awakens the parts of him he long ago buried. She doesn't plan this. The feminine mirror never plots. She simply is. She moves through the world with the quiet magnetism of awareness. She doesn't perform softness, she embodies it. She doesn't chase understanding, she becomes it. Her stillness unsettles him. Her silence exposes him. Her gaze pierces the armor he spent his life building. To the unawakened man, this is dangerous. Because to look into her eyes is to remember everything he tried to forget. The mirror trap begins here. Not in deceit, not in manipulation, but in reflection. He starts to feel small in her calm. He calls it distance. He starts to feel unsure in her boundaries. He calls it coldness. He starts to feel exposed in her honesty. He calls it cruelty. But she has done nothing except exist. And that is the unbearable paradox of the feminine mirror. Her mere presence dismantles illusion. Her truth becomes the undoing of his ego. In the beginning, he mistakes it for love. She mirrors back his beauty, his passion, his confidence, and he basks in it. He feels powerful beside her, more alive than ever. But love built on projection is not love. It is fascination with one's own reflection. And the moment she stops reflecting what flatters him, the moment she withdraws her attention, her nurturing, her approval, he panics. He feels betrayed, humiliated, even punished. But it's not her absence that hurts him. It's his own emptiness that echoes in it. She sees what he cannot, not because she is above him, but because she has walked through her own darkness. She knows the taste of illusion, the ache of seeking worth in another's gaze. That is why her silence now is sacred. It is not rejection. It is revelation. She mirrors his unconscious, and he mistakes the mirror for the wound. But the truth is simpler. She is showing him what he has always refused to see. In every mythology, the mirror is double-edged. It can illuminate truth, or destroy illusion. And in the hands of the awakened feminine, it does both. Because she doesn't exist to validate the ego. She exists to awaken the soul. And when she holds the mirror steady, the mask begins to crack. He feels it first as discomfort, then as anger, then as loss. But underneath it all, something ancient begins to stir. The faint pulse of awakening. The narrator's tone softens, slow, deliberate. You see, the mirror is not the enemy. It is the initiation. The test every man must face, if he is to transcend his persona and meet his own depth. But most run. Most blame the mirror. They call her too intense, too emotional, too much. They shatter the reflection before it shatters their ego. Yet the truth remains. He will see her again, in every woman who follows, until he finally learns that what he feared was never her power, but his own unseen self. When a woman mirrors a man, she doesn't imitate, she reveals. He believes he is seeing her, reading her, controlling the rhythm of their connection. But in truth, he is standing before the most unflinching mirror of his own psyche. Her silence, her warmth, her sudden distance, all of it echoes back the truth of who he is beneath the stories he tells himself. It begins innocently. He feels drawn to her because she listens, because she reflects his thoughts with a kind of sacred stillness that makes him feel understood. But the unconscious does not rest in peace under the illusion of being seen. It stirs. It begins to project, to pour itself outward, because every man secretly fears the day a woman will see too much. And she does. In Jungian language, she becomes the mirror of his anima, the inner feminine he represses and denies. The anima lives deep inside every man, a quiet pool of emotions, intuition, and vulnerability he once learned to silence. Yet when a woman reflects him, not by performance, but by presence, she awakens that forgotten pool. Suddenly, he is overwhelmed by feelings he can neither name nor control. This is where the mirroring becomes dangerous, not for her, but for him. Because what he sees in her eyes is not only admiration or affection. It is the shadow of his own weakness. The reflection of every insecurity he thought he buried beneath ambition, logic, and distance. She doesn't speak it, she doesn't need to. Her stillness is the confrontation. He begins to feel exposed. The very mirror that once flattered him now feels like judgment. Her silence, once inviting, becomes unbearable. Her distance, once magnetic, feels cruel. He cannot understand why her absence feels like rejection, yet her gaze feels like truth. He starts to pull away, not from her, but from what she evokes in him. In truth, she has done nothing. She has simply stopped feeding the illusion. She no longer bends, no longer performs emotional labor to soothe his unevolved ego. She reflects only what is, and that is what destroys him. Because when a man is faced with his own reflection, when he sees his emotional immaturity, his dependency on validation, his performative control, the ego begins to fracture. Jung called this process confronting the shadow, the moment the mask of personality can no longer hold the weight of unconscious truth. Most men run from it. They project blame, they accuse, they minimize. Because it's easier to destroy the mirror than to look into it. But she stands still. She does not defend herself. She does not explain. In her silence, there is power, the kind of power that comes not from dominance, but from seeing clearly. He tries to provoke her, to reignite the dance that once made him feel alive. But her energy has shifted. She is no longer the vessel of his reflection. She has become something far more dangerous to his ego, a sovereign consciousness. And that is when he feels the collapse. The mirror has turned inward. What once felt like love now feels like exposure. What once felt like intimacy now feels like revelation. Every charm, every manipulation, every silent test he used to control her has been stripped bare by her unwavering clarity. In her eyes, he sees not the woman he wanted to possess, but the self he has yet to face. And deep down he knows, it was never her silence that hurt him. It was his own voice, echoing back from the hollow chambers of his shadow. Because mirroring doesn't destroy the man. It destroys his illusion. And for a man who lives only through illusion, that feels like death. It begins quietly. The way every unraveling begins, not with thunder, but with silence. He starts to feel her distance not as absence, but as accusation. The same eyes that once mirrored his brilliance now reflect his emptiness. He cannot bear it. The mirror, once flattering, now feels cruel. The unconscious, once hidden, demands to be seen. In that moment, the man's ego enters battle. He wages war not on her, but on the reflection she holds. Because to the ego, truth feels like annihilation. Jung said the shadow resists exposure because it fears dissolution. It fears that if seen, it will cease to exist. And so he fights. Not out of hatred, but out of self-preservation. He starts to test her boundaries. He withdraws affection, withholds validation, punishes her silence with his own. He becomes colder, harder, more detached, hoping that his control will restore the illusion. But the more he resists, the clearer her reflection becomes. Every cold word, every manipulative silence, every attempt to dominate, all of it shines under the light of her calm awareness. The mirror holds steady. And that's what infuriates him most. Because no matter how he tries to distort the image, she does not bend. She no longer dances to his rhythm. She no longer reflects what he wishes to see. Instead, she becomes what Jung called the transcendent function, the state in which opposing forces, ego and unconscious, meet in confrontation and transformation. She embodies that tension, not through words, but through presence. Through the stillness that says, I see you. Even in your cruelty, I see you. That seeing burns. Because in her gaze, the false self, the mask of charm, the illusion of power, the intellectual detachment, all begin to collapse. He feels stripped bare, not by insult or rejection, but by recognition. Recognition is the deepest wound to the ego. To be known fully, without disguise, is to lose the shield of control. So he lashes out. He blames her for his restlessness. He calls her distant, unfeeling, manipulative. Words that once described his own behaviors now become accusations. Projection, Jung said, is the psyche's way of disowning its darkness. The man cannot face his shadow, so he throws it at the woman who holds it. But she no longer accepts it. Where once she absorbed his moods and tried to soothe the storm, now she simply stands in the eye of it. Unmoved. Grounded. A storm that knows its own stillness. And in that stillness, something ancient stirs. This is not merely a relationship dynamic. It is the battle between consciousness and the unconscious, the eternal dance of the animus and anima, the masculine and feminine principles at war within him. The ego seeks dominance, the soul seeks union. And she, the mirror, has become the battleground. Yet she does not fight, because she understands something he does not, that war is a symptom of fear, not power. She withdraws not out of weakness, but wisdom. Her absence is not punishment, it is purification. The mirror cannot heal in chaos. It must step back into clarity. He mistakes this for abandonment, for indifference. But it is the highest act of love, to no longer participate in his delusion. And so, as he thrashes against the invisible walls of his own psyche, she becomes quieter, softer, more distant, until one day he looks around and realizes she is gone. Not physically, perhaps, but energetically. The mirror has left the room. And in her absence, the truth hits him with the weight of everything he's avoided. The reflection he tried to destroy was never her. It was himself. The war he fought was not against her boundaries, but against his own unconscious. The love he thought he lost was never external. It was the echo of his own buried soul. He is left alone with what Jung called the great silence of the self. The point where the ego realizes it is not the center, but a fragment, a temporary vessel for something far greater and more mysterious. In that silence, the shattering happens. The mirror breaks, not into chaos, but into light. Each shard reflecting a piece of him he has long refused to see: fear, tenderness, longing, shame, love. And for the first time, he doesn't look away. He kneels before the fragments of the self he once despised and begins to understand. The destruction was never punishment. It was initiation. The mirror didn't destroy him. It revealed the man who was buried beneath his own defenses. When she finally withdraws, the world around him grows unbearably quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that hums like a wound, echoing through the spaces where her presence once lived. He tells himself he doesn't care. He fills his time with noise, with work, distraction, bodies that feel warm but mean nothing. He keeps himself moving because to stop would mean to feel. And to feel would mean to face the truth that she was never just a woman. She was the mirror that revealed his soul. Yet her absence is not the kind that time heals. It is not an ache that dulls, but one that deepens. It seeps into his sleep, into his thoughts, into the unguarded hours when the ego grows tired of pretending. In the dead of night, he begins to remember. Not her words, she rarely spoke much, but her energy. The way she could listen without losing herself, the way her silence held him accountable without ever needing to scold. The way she could see through his defenses like they were made of glass. He begins to sense it, the truth he's tried to outrun, that her absence is not emptiness, but reflection. Jung wrote that when the anima withdraws, the man must turn inward, because what he seeks outside no longer responds to him. The outer feminine recedes so the inner feminine can rise. This is the descent, the beginning of psychological death. He feels it like falling. Every illusion, every egoic identity, the conqueror, the charmer, the intellectual, they crumble beneath the gravity of that silence. He feels the hollowness where validation once lived. The loneliness beneath control. The boy hidden inside the man, still longing to be seen and loved, yet terrified of being truly known. And that is when her power truly begins. Because the feminine in her highest form does not chase when the masculine resists growth. She withdraws her reflection, not as punishment, but as invitation. The invitation to face himself, to sit in the fire of his own making. She walks away quietly, not out of resentment, but because she knows the difference between connection and attachment. She understands what Jung and the Stoics both knew. Love without individuation is dependency, and dependency is the death of the soul. So she lets go. Not with bitterness, but with clarity, a clarity that terrifies the man still bound by illusion. Her silence becomes sacred. Her distance becomes the crucible of his awakening. For the first time, he sees her not as an extension of his story, but as an independent being, whole, untouchable, radiant in her self-containment. And in that realization, something shifts inside him. The war ends. The projection falters. The mirror he once tried to control now becomes a lesson carved into his very bones. That love is not possession. That reflection is not validation. That seeing another's soul requires the courage to face your own. And somewhere in that long silence, a new awareness is born, fragile, flickering, but real. He begins to sit with his own emptiness. He listens to the echo of his past cruelty, his manipulations, his fears. He begins to understand that what he hated in her was never her. It was the reflection of his unloved parts. The parts he exiled. The parts that cried out for compassion. This is what Jung called the integration of the shadow. To stop running from what hurts. To see the monster and realize it is your child in disguise. Her withdrawal forces this reckoning. Her absence becomes his teacher. Her silence becomes scripture. He no longer looks outward for rescue. He no longer searches her eyes for forgiveness. He begins, slowly, painfully, to forgive himself, not for what he did to her, but for what he did to his own soul. And in that process, he begins to understand her. Not as a lover, but as an archetype, the self, the divine feminine, the mirror of his lost wholeness. He realizes that she never wanted to destroy him. She wanted him to awaken. And in walking away, she gave him the one thing his ego could never offer, truth. Her absence, once unbearable, now becomes sacred space. A temple in which he begins to meet the parts of himself that were buried under pride. He begins to see. And while he finally opens his eyes, she is already far beyond him, not physically, but spiritually. She has descended too, into her own inner world, no longer defined by his projections or his validation. Her individuation has begun. Where she once mirrored him, she now becomes the mirror for herself. She studies her own wounds, her own shadows, her own attachment to being the savior, the healer, the muse. She begins to reclaim her power from the need to be understood. In solitude, she finds something far deeper than validation, self-containment. And in that wholeness, her energy shifts entirely. She no longer represents the mirror of his ego, but the embodiment of her own divine essence. She is no longer reflection. She is radiance. No longer mirror, but light. And that light cannot be possessed. Because when a woman integrates her shadow, She stops being a mirror for others. She becomes a sun, radiant, self-sustaining, untouchable. And somewhere far away he feels it, not as pain but as reverence. Because when she withdrew, he lost his mirror, but she found her soul. There comes a moment, long after the echo of her footsteps fades, when the air itself seems different. The silence no longer screams. The ache no longer burns. Something else has taken root, something deeper, calmer, inevitable. He no longer searches for her shadow in other faces. He no longer reaches for her name like a prayer. What remains is the quiet recognition that the love he sought from her was never about her at all. It was the soul calling him home through her reflection. And now, the mirror has turned inward. He begins to understand that what broke him was never her leaving. It was the shattering of his illusion that love could exist without truth. That closeness could exist without consciousness. That intimacy could thrive while he remained divided from himself. For a long time, he had mistaken her silence for cruelty. But now he sees, her silence was mercy. It was the sacred pause between who he was and who he could become. In that realization, the war inside him finally stills. The anima, that eternal feminine within, no longer hides in shadow. She rises, soft yet unyielding, like light through a cracked window. He no longer projects her outward onto the women he desires or the lovers he blames. He begins to integrate her, to hold her, to listen. The Jungian Jung spoke of the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage between the masculine and feminine within, begins quietly, like breath. He begins to see the beauty in his own vulnerability, the courage in feeling, the strength in surrender. And for the first time, he no longer fears the mirror, because he has become it. Meanwhile, far from his internal awakening, she moves through her own rebirth. Where once she was defined by reflection, loved for her empathy, desired for her stillness, used as a vessel for men's projections, she now stands sovereign in her own frequency. Her heart no longer performs. Her silence is no longer reaction, it is creation. She speaks less, yet her presence says everything. There is no chase in her energy anymore, only magnetism. The kind that comes from knowing that what belongs to her does not need to be pursued. She is no longer waiting to be chosen. She is choosing herself, over and over again, in the small rituals of peace that mark a life reclaimed. This is the feminine in her individuated state, not soft in the way the world demands, but soft in the way the ocean is, powerful, vast, eternal. Her love no longer rescues, it awakens. Her empathy no longer enables, it witnesses. Her presence no longer reflects others, it radiates truth. And that is when he feels it, the pull of something ancient and wordless. Not desire but reverence. He sees her now, not as the woman he lost, but as the mirror of what he could become. The light that once blinded him now guides him. He no longer clings to her image, he aspires to her essence. Because the true purpose of the mirror was never to hold him captive, it was to set him free. In her wholeness, he recognizes the path to his own. In her detachment, he learns devotion without possession. In her radiance, he finds the courage to face his darkness. And this is where the story transcends love as the world defines it. Because love, in its highest form, is not two halves seeking completion, it is two wholes meeting in reverence. The man who once feared her silence now honors it. The woman who once carried his projections now stands untouched by them. Their connection, no longer rooted in need, becomes something sacred, the awareness of two souls who have seen through illusion and returned to essence. He finally understands the paradox. The mirror that once destroyed his ego was the same mirror that revealed his soul. And the woman who once haunted him in absence was never gone. She was simply returned to herself. The feminine that once reflected his wounds now embodies her divinity. The masculine that once resisted truth now bows before it. In this moment, they are not lovers, nor enemies, nor saviors. They are symbols of the same eternal process, the death of illusion and the birth of consciousness. She walks through the world now like light walks through glass, uncontained, unafraid, unforgotten. He watches her not to possess, but to remember what it means to see. Because the mirror was never meant to flatter. It was meant to awaken. And when she withdrew her reflection, she forced him to find his own. That is the secret Jung understood. Every relationship is a mirror, not to show us who the other is, but who we are beneath the mask. She was never the lesson, she was the invitation. And he, in losing her, accepted it. So when they finally meet again, maybe in another lifetime, maybe in a glance across a crowded room, there will be no chase, no war, no shadow left unspoken. Only recognition. Not of what they were, but of what they became through each other. And in that silence between them, vast and wordless, the truth will shimmer like morning light across water. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak, she simply sees more.